Thank you for joining us this morning for our Legal Marijuana Market Enforcement Grant Program Grant Review Committee meeting to look at the 2025-27 final grant application review. We are going to be muting everyone until discussion time, since we seem to be having some conflicting sound issues going on here. And also I have a different microphone set up than usual. So if you ever can't hear me or have issues with that, please let me know so that I can try and resolve them. So again, welcome everyone. Reminder, this is a public meeting, so we are going to be recording the meeting today. If you can go ahead and use the raise hand function if you have a comment to make, and then verbally give your comments, that would help us just make sure everything is on record and everything is addressed appropriately. Since this is a public meeting, there are members of the public here in attendance. However, from here on out, I will be addressing the Grant Review Committee. We have time set aside towards the end of the presentation for public comment. So if you are a member of the public and not a Grant Review Committee member, please hold your comments until that public comment period. And Grant Review Committee members, just to make sure everything is consistent and on track, if you have a question about a specific application, please address your question to us at CJC and we'll follow up with the applicant just to make sure everything follows the correct procedure during the meeting. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into today's meeting. We have a lot to talk about. So here is our anticipating meeting schedule. We'll do roll call in a moment. Then we're going to quickly go through the GRC roles and responsibilities in the application review, just that general information that we need to go through every time we do one of these reviews. And then we will get into the bulk of the meeting, which will be doing those actual final application reviews and having discussion on the different applications and potential budget scenarios. Then, as I mentioned before, we'll have 5 minutes for public comment, and then we'll go into what the next steps may be moving forward. So let's go ahead and do roll call for our GRC members. Rob Bovet, are you present?
I am. I'm present.
Great, welcome. Thank you for coming. Tim Svensson.
Yep, I'm here. Thank you.
Welcome, Tim. Chris Gibson.
I'm here as well.
Welcome, Chris. Rosie Shatkin.
I am here. I couldn't get that off fast enough. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. And just for the rest of folks, Rosie is our new representative from OLCC. So she is new to the GRC and thankfully just jumped right in to help us today. Then Sunny Summers, are you present?
Good afternoon, I'm here.
Good afternoon. And Shannon Savell.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize. My voice isn't all there.
Thank you for joining us. Kathy Keys.
I'm here.
Kathy. Aaron Felton.
I'm here.
Nice to have you with us, Aaron. And Tyler Bechtel.
Hi there, I'm here.
Hi, wow, this is amazing. We have everyone here. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to be part of this meeting. As you know, we've got some difficult decisions ahead of us, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. So Grant Review Committee roles and responsibilities in application review. As many of you are probably familiar with at this point, the CJC staff review the applications for completeness. We assess the applications for adherence to the program rules and priorities. And then hope to help make sure you folks in the commission or in the grant review committee and commissioners apply those program rules consistently. Your role as GRC members is to evaluate applications and discuss them collaboratively, provide recommendations for funding applicants or funding to applicants, and then provide final funding recommendations to the commission. And then, of course, the commission takes all of that. They do their own evaluation of the applications and budget requests and make the ultimate funding decisions. Today's review process, we want to make sure that it's grounded in the grant purposes and requirements as outlined in the solicitation and the rules. And then we also, of course, look to the CJC Grant Administration Guide for those standards that we have across grants. And as part of the staff review, hopefully, we've done most of that for you, but those are things that we constantly look to when making these determinations. We also look to the requirements, priorities, and preferences in the statute and the request for grant proposals. And for those, we want to make sure that they're applied consistently. And just a reminder, only the things listed in the solicitation can be considered. So for example, we did include some prior contract performance numbers in the program summaries we shared. And that's great information to look at for context for the current application that folks submitted. But we can't make determinations solely based off of that because that was not in the solicitation itself. This is a competitive grant. And of course, we ask that GRC members disclose any conflicts and follow the state ethical guidelines. Just a few more notes on conflict. We ask that if you have an actual or potential conflict, so that is when you as a public official participates in an action which could or would result in a financial benefit or loss to you, your relative, or your business, that you let us know, you disclose that conflict, and you also do not participate in any deliberations or votes to approve or not approve an award or that entity you may have conflict with. And just to be consistent with how our commissioners operate, what they do is if there is even a potential public perception of impropriety, so that's no actual or potential conflict exists, but maybe they're just associated with the county. They're not part of the agency that's applying, but they're in the same county, so they might choose to not vote on that particular application as well, just to avoid any kind of perception of impropriety. So as we're going through the applications, if you do have an actual or potential conflict, please do speak up so that we can have that on record. So just a reminder, these are the legislative priorities for the marijuana grant. And I just wanted to go through the actual language that's in the rules, because usually we abbreviate it, but we just thought it was important to post the whole language since we are getting very technical and specific when we do these reviews. So the commission will prioritize grant applications that demonstrate how financial assistance and support to local law enforcement agencies and district attorneys will address any or all of the following. So rural areas of the state, large-scale unlawful marijuana cultivation or distribution operations, organized crime involved in unlawful marijuana cultivation or distribution operations, operations that divert marijuana outside of the state, and coordination with community-based organizations that provide assistance to or services for individuals subject to the ongoing humanitarian crisis associated with unlawful marijuana cultivation or distribution operations. And some language I just want to draw your attention to here that will, refer back to as we move forward is this any or all language. So these legislative priorities, you can choose to apply any or all of them in your review of the applications. Similarly, in reviewing grant applications, the Commission and the GRC may give preference to applications that demonstrate that an applicant will, one, participate in training opportunities that assist the applicant in addressing and prosecuting unlawful marijuana cultivation or distribution operations. Two, address cases that require complex financial forensic accounting. Three, track and report on outcomes as described by the Commission in this solicitation. Four, collaborate with other local governments and agencies to achieve multi-jurisdictional outcomes consistent with the criteria described in the previous slide. And provide access to trauma-informed and culturally and linguistically specific and responsive services to persons affected by the ongoing humanitarian crisis associated with the illegal marijuana market. So those are the Commission priorities. And we'll come back to those again as well. So now we're going to get into the final application review. First, we're going to look at, the just basic list of who applied, the applications we received, get into the staff analysis and what our recommendations are for it moving forward. And then we'll have some room for some discussion with you folks. So just first of all, I do want to note that the available funding got updated. So if you looked at that program summary sheet that I shared with you, and just the list of applicants that I shared with you earlier last week, the funding amount is actually a little higher now. We were able to confirm that some of the rollover funds were a little higher than we initially estimated. So the total available funding is at $12,399,000. So just a little bit more. And the solicitation allowed for a project period for most folks of January 1st, 2026 to August 30th, 2027, although applicants were given the ability to start October 1st of this year as well. So it's either a 23-month or a 20-month project period. Eligible applicants are, of course, cities and counties, CBOs, and any combination of the above. And the program types we're going to be looking at are established or implementation. And everyone met the baseline criteria in their final applications for receiving funding through this program. So here is a breakdown of the final applications we received, broken out by law enforcement and CBO agencies, and the amount of funds that each requested. I did separate out the law enforcement funds and the CBO funds based on that allocation recommendation that we discussed in the last GRC meeting. So that gives 17.8% of that 12,399 to CBOs, which comes out to about $2,207,022. And then the other portion of it, the 82.2%, is then earmarked for law enforcement agencies, and that amounts to $10,191,978. Both of those groups, the funds requested were well over the amount available, and overall, we have about $9.5 million that we need to reconcile to meet the total funds available for this grant program. And of course, feel free to raise your hand and jump in if you have comments or questions at any point. All right. So the way this presentation is structured and sort of how we saw the decision-making process going is looking at the application performance first, then on top of that, kind of applying those legislative and commission priorities based on the priorities that you folks determine to be highest priority now in this biennium. And then building out some funding scenarios based on those two things that either speak to maintaining broad geographic coverage for the program or focusing funding in high activity areas. And that's just kind of how staff, once we laid out all of the options, how they sort of grouped together and played out when we looked at them. So first, we're going to look at application performance. And the CJC staff analysis, of course, went through the applications. We scored them using the scoring rubric that we published with the RFGP. And those scores are based on responsiveness and completeness of the application's answers, or the applicant's answers, excuse me. Then we went through the budgets and did some baseline budget reductions, which included removing unallowable items and then reducing all applicant budgets to a 23-month project period, since that was the maximum allowed under the solicitation. And I'll go into more detail on all these steps in the subsequent slides. So you'll be able to see in more detail what we did for each of these steps. Then the third thing we did was other recommended budget reductions. And that really entailed doing a bit of an analysis of the current application or the current grantee budgets for folks that were applying again for funding in this next biennium that were already funded in the last biennium. So looking at what they had remaining at the end of their contract. And based on that, we thought it was appropriate to reduce those budgets to 20 months. So take that additional quarter off where the project period overlaps with what their current contract covers. We also, looked at all of the individual line items and thought it might be appropriate to cap all trainings at 2 attendees, since some applicants were requested for like 8 or 11 attendees for trainings. And that way we're still funding that priority of making sure folks are trained, that commission priority number 1, but we're just applying a reasonable restriction to it. And then, of course, we adjusted the administrative rate for any applicant where those changes had made the administrative rate be higher than 10%, which is the maximum allowed. So we'll get into each of those steps so a little bit more. So the scoring rubric hopefully looks familiar to you. It's just a rubric we use to the group or the marijuana team at CJC individually scores the application. We take the totals for each question and average them out to get the total score. So this is an analytical tool and not a decision-making device. I want to say that. And as you'll see later, the scores are presented both as a total and as a percentage of points possible, because some of the questions applied only to law enforcement and not to CBOs. So those denominators were a little bit different across those two groups. So we included the percentage of points possible to make it more comparable. So here's a breakdown of the final application scores for each of the applicants, ordered from highest scoring to lowest scoring. And the column in yellow is that percent of points possible. And we're going to come back to this, but so this is kind of how, based on the staff analysis, all the applicants ranked when we look at them all together. So please, speak up if you have any comments or disagreement with what that list looks like. That's sort of how everything fell, based just purely on the rank or the scoring of the applications. So going more into those baseline budget reductions, as I mentioned, folks could either do a 23-month budget or a 20-month budget. So the first step was just to reduce everyone to a 23-month budget, because we did have some folks that asked for more than 23 months, which was just not allowed under the solicitation. Then we also removed unallowable line items per the grant administration guide. And those two changes together took off about $235,000. So not what we need to reduce the amount by, but it did take some off. The other recommended budget reductions. So as I mentioned, we looked at for those applicants that have a contract currently, what their remaining amount was. So this chart shows the remaining amount on their contract as of 6/30. And then based on the average amount, the average expenditure amount per quarter for the last biennium, we calculated how many quarters they could continue based on that amount. And as you can see, many of them, if they were allowed to, could continue even past January, even when their new contract would kick in if they're awarded. So based on that, what we decided to do was for everyone except for Columbia, which has spent out all of their funds, reduce all of their budgets to 20 months instead of 23 months, the maximum, because based on that expenditure analysis, they should be able to make it to the end of December 31st when their current contract ends, rather than needing overlap in that quarter where there's an overlapping project period between the two different funding cycles. So as I mentioned, we reduced the number of people attending to the trainings. We also adjusted per diem where possible. Not everyone included those calculations, so we weren't able to adjust them, but where possible, we adjusted the per diem to be the allowable rate, and then did the project period month adjustment and adjusted the administrative rate. So based on all of those other recommended budget reductions, that reduced the total ask by another $781,332. So at this point in time, do GRC members have any concerns about any of those recommended budget reductions? Or do those sound appropriate to you folks? So Tyler, looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, I'm looking at the contract period reduction to
Yep.
20 months based on the monthly spend rate. But I would think too, I guess I need to know a little bit more about it, because I would think for some of our Southern Oregon teams, they're just hitting their most busy and therefore most expensive time of the year.
So this was based off of more than just the recent months of expenditures. It was for a full biennium period, so that kind of takes into account those higher activity months. And for the Southern Oregon folks too, I mean, if you look at the actual numbers, Jackson County has enough that with their average expenditure rate, they could last for 3.5 more quarters. So that's well beyond just one more quarter. Same with Josephine and many of the other ones. So I think that does actually balance out.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That answers my question.
You're welcome. Okay, any other questions or concerns about this? If folks are okay with this methodology, we can just go ahead and move forward with it. If you have concerns and don't want to implement one of these recommended budget reductions, please speak up and let us know. Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. So on the slides, when we look at the individual budget requests for applicants, these changes are reflected there, so you can actually see, what changes were made from their initial request, and then the staff recommended budget changes. So if you have any questions when we move forward and are actually going through the applications themselves, again, please speak up. We can roll back any of these recommended budget reductions if you determine from looking at the actual applications that they don't make sense to you. We can definitely do that. So that brings us to the legislative and commission priorities. So here's an abbreviated list of what those are, get them fresh in your mind. As I noted, the legislative priorities include that language, any or all, and then the commission priorities are kind of on top of that. You can adopt any or all of them. The language is a little more vague there, but that's when you look at it all together, how it can be applied. So after looking at the scores and just, thinking through the purposes of the grant, the staff recommendation is to prioritize applications that best demonstrate all applicable legislative priorities. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next few slides. Our thought was that the legislative priorities really speak to, those purposes of the grant, what the grant funds are intended to combat, what they're intended to do. Whereas the commission priorities are also very important, but those are more about how the program operates. So just honing in and focusing on the legislative priorities might make our decision-making process, more in line with the purposes of the grant, since we have some tough decisions to make. So based on the legislative priorities, we, as I said, we honed in on the scores for those five priorities, five priorities. And we created a ranked list of applicants based on just looking at those legislative priorities. So that list on the left is just solely focusing on the legislative priorities. And you can see the scoring for each section is in the parentheses, or the applicant score for that section is in the parentheses. So, South Coast Interagency Narcotics Team is scored the highest on that, along with Josephine. In number 2 is Deschutes and Jackson County, with only 1 point difference between those top 2 ranks, and so forth. Because there has been a strong emphasis on the folks that are working in the rural areas of the state in previous biennium, we wanted to add in a scale for the how rural an applicant's area was. So we created a rural adjustment, and that takes the score for that legislative priority number 1 that deals with, how rural that application is, and multiplied it by the percentage of population that is rural according to the census. And we got then a legislative priority rank with a rural adjustment. So it slightly changed the order of, the rank for the different applicants. For example, Jackson is now the highest ranking because they have such a high percentage of their population as being rural. And then Sint and Josephine went from number 1 to number 2 in the ranked list. So you don't have to necessarily make this decision now, but it would be good to get consensus on, whether this prioritization, focusing in on those legislative priorities, makes sense, and which version you think makes the most sense, just looking at the priorities or incorporating that rural adjustment as we have in the past. And I did want to say here too, our calculation method was a little bit different than we've used previously, but when I compared how applicants actually fell, the rank order is basically the same as when we applied a rural adjustment previously. So if folks want to discuss that, share their thoughts on whether, focusing in on those legislative priorities is appropriate, and if you want to do that, which of these rankings makes more sense? as I mentioned, we don't have to apply this. This was the staff recommendation. We could just go purely based on total score. If there are any thoughts or questions, or if folks are confused or concerned, please, now is the time. Tyler?
I want to hear everyone's voice and not my own, I promise. But I'm gonna go here. I just, I mean, they're all rural counties to me.
Mhm.
When I look at this, yes, we have Eugene and Medford, and Clackamas County being close to Portland, all huge population centers, but the vast majority of the counties by land are rural. And you know, I just think that we're not taking into account the infrastructure that some of those larger counties might have. I just, when we applied the rural points to Columbia County and Yamhill County, to see them still down at the bottom, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And it seems needlessly complicated, and I just don't see how it helps prioritize this.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
so would your recommendation be to scrap the legislative priority ranking entirely, or go with the priority ranking that does not take in that rural adjustment?
No, I like the legislative priority ranking. Obviously,
Okay.
that's guiding why we are here. So that should be there. The rural portion of that, I don't understand how this emphasis was applied, and I don't think it necessarily points to the best use of enforcement dollars to
Okay.
have that weigh into it. Now, as far as the actual ranking, that was done by the legislative priority ranking was done by staff, correct?
That is correct.
Is it, am I missing where we see that ranking, or are we just seeing the total scores?
So this is just based on those scores for that section, that legislative priority rank section. So if you go in on, in that applicant summary sheet that was shared with everyone, where we have a score breakout, and we'll have it later on in the presentation too, when we go into the individual applications. If you just add up the scores in that section where it's talking about legislative priority, that's what you get. You get 30 points for cent. So
Okay.
it's purely based on the scores for those sections.
Perfect. I'll take a better look at that then. I like the legislative priority rank. I don't understand how the rural rank adds much to it.
Okay, thank you. I think Rosie's hand was up next. Did you want to add something?
Yes, I actually was going to say I like it, but I noticed my colleague from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, who's probably much more knowledgeable about this process. So I'm going to let her go because she might have the same message that or a case as I do. So I'm going to defer to her here and just listening.
Okay, so Sunny.
Good afternoon. I guess maybe I missed it, but and for the record, Sunny Summers, Oregon Department of Ag. The rural adjustment, is that based on population or land mass?
So it's population, percentage of the population deemed rural as according to the census.
Okay, I think it could be a useful adjustment if it was based on land mass. I don't really care how many people are rural. I care how much of that land is rural and has the potential for illegal marijuana grows. I think that's a maybe a more accurate representation of what you were trying to do.
We can absolutely go back and do that calculation, but we did the calculation in previous biennium, and the ranked list looked pretty much exactly like this, with honing in on land mass rather than people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But we can do that calculation again. I don't want to make it seem like we can't. We would need to make some changes if we want to go that direction to the presentation, which is totally fine. But we can absolutely do that calculation based on percent of land that's rural. Just, when we compared those two from how we did it previously, which was based on land, there was no real difference between the rankings.
And does that take into account tax base? I think that's maybe some of what Tyler was trying to address is you could have a lot of rural, but you could also have a really high percentage of people in areas that pay more taxes. Yeah, some of these counties seem like they may not have the same infrastructure available to them.
So the calculation did not take into consideration the taxes. We would have to definitely go back and try and figure that out separately, and then represent based on that, since that wasn't a calculation method we've used previously or thought to use this time. But it's a good suggestion for sure. And I mean, we could do that if where do you know where we would get that data?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Not to make your job harder. I'm just trying to think of like what really are we trying to adjust here? And I think it's, what resources are available and what's the opportunity for both for the illegal production as well as the ability to pay for the impact of that potential illegal production.
Yeah, yeah, so given that the rest of the data we were able to get from the census, for example, so it's something we could work in very easily. Anything where we would have to do some research, obviously that would take us longer to do, and maybe this particular set of decisions might not be the right time to do it. Tyler, is your hand up again?
Yeah, it was. I think what I was trying to get at and what Sunny kind of keyed in on is the whole rural portion of this that the legislator carved out, to me, says that the legislature thought that these rural areas had a higher need or less resources to begin with.
Right.
And so but then when I do look at this and how it shook out with taking rural into account, I mean, I know Jackson County facilities, for instance, are much nicer than maybe Yamhill County facilities. So I guess just the rural portion of it doesn't necessarily adequately reflect the infrastructure and resources already in place.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's a way for us to measure that, but I'm keyed in on the rural portion because to me that says the legislature is trying to determine need. And then, but at the same time, when we apply it, it doesn't necessarily reflect infrastructure and need. And so
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to it, but I guess I thank Sunny for alluding to what I was thinking.
And again, I think, that question is a little bit different than what percentage is rural, which is the information that we have available and might take a little bit more thought and a little bit more time. Aaron, did you have your hand up as well? I think your microphone is muted still.
You're right. Thanks. No, I think I'm probably, to get to the point, I'm probably at the place Tyler's at in terms of preferring the legislative priorities over the rural adjustment. Although I think it's a great conversation. I have it regularly about, is Polk County a rural county or a non-rural county, and what constitutes a rural county. And so it is a terrific conversation, being in a county which I think a lot of people would assume is rural here in Polk, but we're one of the top 10 fastest growing counties, with probably the casino and Grand Ronde being the top tourist attraction in the state. So what defines rural? Who's the most country of all? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think, it's a great conversation, right? But I look at the results, you end up with Yamhill and Columbia being on the bottom of both. And I would say Yamhill is one of the most sophisticated urban counties in the state for different reasons. And then probably all counties have a segment of rural in them. And I think even Multnomah, Marion, Lane, and all of and Deschutes would say they have some extraordinary rural areas to them. So I'm with Tyler. I think the legislative priorities reflect why the legislature allocated this money. And so to wrap up a long comment, I'll go with that.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like Chris and also has a comment, and then Rob after Chris.
I do have a comment and a question both. I'm in
Sure.
agreement as well. The legislative priority should be the more important rank. I've got a question though, and we may be getting to it. I may be way ahead of myself, but when I start looking at this, it looks to me like pretty much all things are equal, and it doesn't look like staff recommended or didn't find that any of the applicants didn't meet or at least address the priorities, correct?
Yeah, so some scored a little bit lower than others, but everyone is eligible for funding. I think the determination in front of you guys, and as we get a little deeper into the conversation about do we want broader geographic coverage or to focus funding more in high need areas, we can talk about whether you folks recommend funding everyone or not. But
Well,
everyone met the baseline for getting funding.
And that's the question kind of I have is I'm not seeing in the applications really very much information at all about how you would assess need. All but one of the applicants is a repeat from previous years.
Yeah.
That being Clackamas County. So everybody has been awarded funding. The other thing that concerns me a little bit, and I realize it's not part of this, but there's really not, from what I'm seeing, a lot of accountability for money that's been spent previously in terms of performance metrics to show what has been accomplished with funding in previous years. The other comment that I'll make and asked about as well is this biennium. I know the funding is quite a bit less than it's been in previous years.
Yeah.
How much less is that?
The funding has fluctuated substantially from year to year. So the actual amount of funding this biennium is more than last biennium, but the overall contract period that we're coming to the end of incorporated, that huge bump in 2022 that was like, $26 million. And then lower funding amounts after that were all kind of rolled into one long extended contract. So this is a drop. It is less than what CSL is for this program based on the average expenditures. By, $8 to $10 million, about the amount that we're over in requests.
Yeah. And did the applicants know how much money was available when they submitted the application?
They did not for the preliminary application. For the final application where they submitted budgets, we did have a number for them, and that was communicated to them in the webinar for the final application.
So they did have the opportunity to self-adjust from previous year funding levels based on what they knew was going to be less than the previous or than this year, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. And just to get back to your question or comment about incorporating performance metrics, that is something we're trying to do across the board, especially as we move into a new way of doing business where there's going to be, one large application for counties and a large application for law enforcement. We're going to try and really work in those performance measures. We did take a pretty thorough look at the information we have available. We have a lot of data for this program. When you try and align it specifically with the language in the priorities, it doesn't quite line up. So we weren't able to incorporate that into the scoring. and it also wasn't requested in the application. So another avenue we could do, for the next time we do funding is to make sure that ahead of time, the GRC is very clear about what performance measures they want in the application itself. So then we can use that to score. And Rob, you had your hand up as well?
Yeah, thanks. I have lots of comments, but maybe I'll save a bunch of them for later. On the issue at hand, bottom line is I guess I'm in agreement with where everyone else has landed. It gets real sticky to decide who's rural, who's not.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, that's the language chosen in 2018, and it should have been more surgical, but 2020 hindsight. To me, the intent of the 2018 legislation creating this program was to recognize that local jurisdictions did not have sufficient resources to deal with knocking out the black market. That's how we viewed it at the time. Now, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, and during COVID, it's not just the what you would call normal black market. We had a true surge of drug trafficking organizations moving into Oregon and engaging in labor trafficking and other environmental damage. And so the program just kind of grew pretty exponentially through general fund dollars, not the because quite frankly, there's only $6 million taken off the top of marijuana taxes for a biennium right now to fund this program. And that was deemed sufficient at the time and may have been sufficient at the time in 2018, but now looks pretty tiny by comparison. By comparison, current service level is $22 million per biennium. And I'm glad we have carryover to fill in some, as well as the small allocation of general fund resources in addition to what I call the skim, the 6 million off the top. But we are way down, and we do have hard decisions to make, and I'll have some maybe thoughts about that. But I'm also interested in hearing from folks, because we have an opportunity in 2026 to maybe clean up the program language and statute. I think everybody here knows what we need to do here, which is get funding to the most significant need for taking down these illegal grows that feature environmental damage and labor trafficking and all the other terrible things that are involved. But I'll save all those comments for some time later. I don't have any objection to either pathway, but kind of following along with what Tyler and Chris said, I think using the legislative priorities that you have here on your sheet makes the most sense right now.
Okay. And again, we'll go through, all of the individual applications. We'll see how those legislative priority ranks would be applied to different funding scenarios based on, whether we want to, and I apologize, there's a siren behind me. I hope you guys can't hear it. Based on whether, we want to maintain that geographic coverage or focus in on those high need areas that Rob was just talking about. So we'll look at both of those scenarios and how this legislative priority ranking would play out and then later in the presentation. But for right now, it looks like folks are on board with the staff recommendation to apply those legislative priority ranks and to apply them without the rural adjustment. So we'll move forward with that consensus, since that seems to be where we're at. All right, so for the CBOs, there's only 3 of them. It's a little less complicated. Their priority ranking was a little more straightforward. So, based on purely on score alone, Safety Compass was the highest, then Cannabis Workers Resiliency Project. But when we hone in on those legislative priority rankings, those 2 shifted. So now the highest ranked CBO is CWRP, then Safety Compass, and then JBRJ. So now we're just going to look at a little bit more context for this conversation about broad geographic coverage versus that focused funding for high activity areas. And what I have for you here is just this map that we looked at last time, which I know is a little confusing, but basically what we see are some, higher activity areas. We see that the geographic distribution of sites, of zip codes that have been reported to us where incidents occur has spread out over the years from 2022 when we first started getting data to 2024. So there has been spread of incidents, but there are some, high pocket areas where there's a lot of activity. And then I also added on top of this, based on our CBO data, they ask which county a human trafficking victimization occurred in. And so these were the counties where reports came from, the majority of reports came from. So Marion, Josephine, and Jackson, with some reports coming in for Yamhill and Clackamas as well. So I do want to note here, this was based off of about 1.5 years of reporting from the CBOs. It was about 530 folks altogether that the reports came in for. We are, obviously it's probably not a complete picture of all the victimization that's happening related to these illegal grows. For example, our biggest current CBO grantee has a huge reach in Southern Oregon. So of course they're going to get a lot more reports there. There probably are victimizations happening all across the state that we just aren't getting reported. So, with that caveat, I still think it's kind of interesting to see, just as something to think about as we move forward, where the two things are happening simultaneously, right? Where we're getting the incident reports, and then where we're also getting reports of where the human trafficking victimization occurred. Tyler?
Is this just CBO data from?
So the dots, those are incidents, so that's coming from law enforcement. The arrows with the percentages, the red arrows and the red percentages, that's the CBO data that I just sort of stuck on top. So it's not the most sophisticated map, I'm sorry.
So the Marion 16%, that's CBO data?
Yes, that's CBO data.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know, just because it didn't make sense with grow data. So thanks.
You're welcome. And again, it could be that the CBO that reported that is located there, so all of their victims are potentially coming from there. There's a lot of fuzziness with that data, but I still thought it was worth considering. So now we're going to get into the applications themselves. And the way that this presentation is structured is to look at the law enforcement applications and kind of talk through those overarching decision-making points and the different funding scenarios that we set up, just to consider. And then we'll get into the CBO ones, if that makes sense to everyone. Okay, so these are ordered by just their, and I apologize. So anyone who's a member of the public, I saw somebody just raise their hand. Please keep your comment until the public comment period. So these are ordered just based on total score, not in the order of the legislative ranking. We'll get back to that later. So our first program is South Coast Interagency Narcotics Team sent. They requested $918,340. Overall, they scored 94% of points possible. And then here is a look at their budget request. So the blue numbers are what they requested initially. Anything that's crossed out means there was an adjustment made through that staff recommended budget cuts. And then the new number with that adjustment is the red number. So, they initially asked for 918,340 with those adjustments that you can see there, like That not. Oh, I didn't cross it out on this one, but basically for this one, like the number of people at the trainings were reduced to 2 people. And some of those adjustments based on the numbers of months and whatnot were incorporated into those red numbers. So does anyone have any comments or questions about SINT? Do you want to discuss this particular application? Or do you want to just roll through all of them and then have a discussion across the board at the end? It's really up to you guys. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to take that as an indication that you want me to just go forth through all of the applications and have a discussion at the end. So we will do that. But please feel free to stop me. So the next applicant is Deschutes. You know, their goal is to continue enforcement, which includes supporting their current team to overtime and then doing educational outreach through the DA's office. Their total budget request was $901,243. They scored 91% of points possible. And here is a look at their budget request. They had a very slimmed down budget request to begin with. They actually only asked for 18 months of funding. So they weren't subject to any of those cuts, which is why the number at the bottom is exactly the same, 901,243. And they're, you know, supporting just their small team of 1 management app analyst, 2 deputies, at 0.2 management analyst and 0.2 DDA at the district attorney's office, and then asking for some supplies and training for a small number of people. So that's Deschutes. So next up is, oh, Chris.
So I've got a preemptive question. When we get
Sure.
to the end of this, are you going to have a balanced budget based on what's available, or are we still going to have a surplus?
So we'll look at different scenarios that kind of fall under those 2 main like decision points of, do we want to fund more programs across the geography, or do we want to have a more targeted funding strategy to high need areas? So we'll look at different scenarios, and based on those scenarios, like some scenarios we'll zero out, some scenarios we might have funding left over we can give back to some people. It just depends on how you apply those different decision points, if that makes sense. But we'll look through examples of all of them for your discussion. So next up is Jackson County. Their goal is to disrupt illegal marijuana trade operations, improve public safety, and support the transition to a regulated and sustainable marijuana market that benefits all residents by providing additional resources to law enforcement and increasing community engagement. They asked for $4,169,552, and they scored overall 89% of points possible. So their budget was one of the budgets that included more months than were even allowed for the solicitation. So they did kind of get more of a haircut when we did that trim, plus the trim down to 20-month project period. So their total ask reduced to, or their adjusted ask based on all those changes is $3,493,060. And again, the majority of that is going to personnel costs, as it is with pretty much all of these programs. So Josephine County is next, another one of our established programs. Their goal is to investigate, research, and dismantle high-impact drug trafficking organizations and organized crime syndicates within the county and ensure illegal marijuana cases are prosecuted. Their funds requested are $2,746,743, and they scored 88% of points possible. And based on those budget changes, or budget reductions that staff recommended. Their total ask just went down slightly to $2,735,943 $1,000 or yeah, $43. And that was really just a reduction in those training costs, reducing the number of people trained from 6 to 2. So it was minimal change to their budget. Next up is our one implementation program, Clackamas County. So their goal is to reduce the prevalence and impact of illegal marijuana cultivation and distribution by enhancing enforcement, providing the prosecuting authority with complete investigations and supporting victims of trafficking and exploitation. They requested $1,259,152, and they scored 78% of points possible. They also just had minimal changes to their budget, mostly around the training and travel, the number of people that they were requesting getting trained. I do want to note here that compared to other programs, since they are implementation, they are asking for a higher percentage of their overall ask be towards equipment. The Bobcat skid steer, mulcher, tilt deck trailer, some of that heavy equipment that folks in the rural areas used to, tear down, dismantle, and destroy all of the infrastructure and illegal marijuana that they find at incidents. So moving on to Klamath County, they are established program. Their goal is to support the continued evolution and expansion of Klamath County's multi-agency response, prioritizing interdepartmental coordination, specialized training, and infrastructure to support and expand long-term capacity for the illegal market enforcement. Their initial request is $1,939,481, and they scored 75% of points possible. I do want to note here that, initially we had Klamath Falls Police Department apply for a separate application based on the feedback that was provided after that preliminary application review we did. They actually withdrew their application, Klamath Falls Police Department did, and they instead partnered with Klamath County and are included on their budget as a line item rather than as a whole separate project. And here is their budget request. Again, minimal changes. So the adjusted amount based on those staff recommended reductions is $1,927,481. Next up, we have Douglas County and another established program. Their goal is to continue funding the existing program, dismantle and disrupt the interstate and international drug trafficking organizations who are operating large-scale illegal marijuana sites and diverting that marijuana outside of the country and state, and to intercept victims of human trafficking. Their request was for $2,275,680, and they also scored 75% of points possible. And they did have more changes to their budget based on they requested a longer project period. So that was reduced down to $2,161,834. So the dollar amount wasn't super different, but it did impact all of their totals for different budget categories. And then we have Lane County, and their goal is to continue to investigate large-scale illegal operations that are tied to DTOs and transnational crime organizations and require dedicated and specially trained investigators. They asked for $1,990,000, and their staff score was also 75% of points possible. And their budget just had minimal changes, really. Those changes just related to the number of people that they were proposing to send to training. So their, adjusted request amount is $1,985,000. Next, we have Yamhill, and their goal is to continue to investigate and eradicate illegal marijuana market sites in Yamhill. Their funds requested are 744,260, and they received 60% of points possible. And they did have some adjustments. Their ask included some unallowable items. And then there were some adjustments just to the totals based on how many units they included. So their ask went from 744,260 to 736,723. Not a huge decrease overall, but there were some slight adjustments made. And last, we have Columbia County, another established program. Their goal is to fund the existing team to investigate and interrupt the growth of illegal marijuana grows, and to follow the money and track it to the source and secure convictions, and also to continue to collaborate with state and federal partners to address ties to other counties, states, and countries. Their request was for $1,419,000 for $433,000. And their staff score was 56% of points possible. And they also were one where we had to adjust the number of months, which is why they had a decrease in their personnel and some of their other things listed under supplies that are, monthly subscription based things. So their adjusted ask is $1,370,401. So with that in mind, does anyone want to discuss any of the individual law enforcement applications, or do you want to just jump into this conversation about the different funding scenarios based on these two overarching concepts? Okay, I don't see any hands, so we'll go ahead and get into these concepts and what they might look like applied to the funding. So broad geographic coverage, what that really, the concept there is to maintain as many programs as we can. We have seen, that incidents have become more geographically distributed over a larger area in, more recent years. So there is some data to support that methodology of funding. To actually fund more programs, what that means is all of them would get less funding. So in the application, we asked applicants to provide different funding scenarios, what their program would look like if it received a 15% cut, a 45% or 30% cut, and a 45% cut. So if we wanted to fund all applicants, so all 10 law enforcement applicants, we would need to apply that 45% reduction. That's just the reduction level we would need to be at to be able to fund all of them. There would be a little bit of funding remaining that we could use to reward those higher ranked applicants. So to give a little bit more money on top of what their budget would look like with the staff recommended reductions and then the additional 45% reduction. So that's one scenario. A second scenario, just under that concept of broad geographic coverage, is to fund some applicants with that same 45% reduction. And then, so that means not funding the lowest ranked applicants. And then having a slightly larger pot of money to go back to the higher ranked applicants. So that's the broad geographic coverage scenarios that how staff thought they could be applied based on what we requested from applicants and looking at the numbers and how much the total ask needed to be reduced. So if we look at the other concept, the focused funding for high activity areas, what that really is doing is not funding all applicants. It's only funding the ones in high activity areas. And how far you get down on the ranked list depends on sort of which funding scenario we're talking about. So the second scenario I mentioned, funding some applicants with a 45% reduction and rewarding higher rank applicants, does fall under that sort of broad concept. But there are a couple of additional scenarios that would also fall under that concept. So scenario 3 that we went through, and we'll have, funding tables to look at for, or to do scaled funding based on rank. So that's doing a different percentage of funding for applicants that scored the best. They get the least percent cut. Applicants that scored in the middle range of that ranked list would get slightly more. And then the ones at the bottom would get the highest cut. Scenario 4 is really kind of the opposite extreme of scenario 1, and that's just funding the awards for the applicants in the highest activity areas. At the most we can fund them before we run out of funds. So those are kind of the scenarios that staff discussed, and any of these can be tweaked and changed, but these were kind of the overarching different methods that we could apply to come up with those the funding amounts based on those broad considerations, the geographic coverage versus the focus funding. So any comments or questions about just the concepts and the different scenarios we're going to look at? So in the next slides, we'll look at what those scenarios actually look like when applied to that legislative rank list. Any comments or questions? All right, Tam?
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of puts me in an awkward position because every single one of these applicants has part of the sheriff's office for the most part. And of course, my number one responsibility as the executive director for the association is to advocate for all of our sheriffs. I just think we're in a very unfortunate situation where we have a very productive program statewide where we just have very little funding available to us to put towards. I think the big question that I had was, you had made a comment earlier about ranking or finding ways to rank applicants based off of previous year's funding and how they spent their money. I see that that's probably not a portion of this conversation, but with the high activity, somewhat of a performance measure based off of how many cases they've produced. And so we are able to use that in part of the consideration moving forward on this application.
So we did not request data on what their previous incident numbers were in prior grant years as part of the solicitation. We did include that information so you guys could look at it and sort of judge, what they're proposing this time around. But we are limited to what was in the application itself, which is not based on that prior performance, but based on what they said they would do with the funds this time around.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and that's the thing, is that it's pretty clear we have a huge need in the Southern Oregon region. I know when we opened it up a little bit more across the state, we started identifying other areas, even though they're a little bit more in the central part of the state, not as rural as the Southern Oregon and not having as the same amount of activity. However, I would probably argue that the cases that they're working have the exact impact on the community that they serve, even though they may not have the total number of cases. They have the same amount of impact up in the central part. So I'd be interested to see what other committee members are thinking as far as if we just apply a base reduction across the board and just give every applicant something, or if we are thinking of maybe a combination, a commingled type of approach between activity and funding requests.
Yeah, and we have, again, tables to look at what each of these scenarios actually look like with dollar amounts. I just wanted to see what overarching thoughts folks had before we get into those. I do want to know, I'll also need like a 5-minute break because I prepared all of the scenarios for both legislative and the legislative rank plus the rural ranking. So I just need to make some adjustments in my presentation real fast so we don't see extraneous information. So I can do that now, or we can continue this conversation and look at take a break in like 5 minutes. Either one of those works. So we can, so Tyler?
Yeah, I just want to go on the record as advocating for an across the board reduction as probably the simplest way to do this. Chris brought up a question like people were given or applicants were given an opportunity to adjust knowing how much money was available. My hope is that they all took a serious look at this and asked for what they needed. And I think I'd caution anyone from predetermining where the problem is in Oregon. I believe that myself and 2 or 3 motivated individuals could show you a cannabis problem anywhere in Oregon that you put us, given the resources to do it. So I would just caution about deciding where the problem is based on our very small limited amount of data for just the last few years. And I think I would like to see an across the board reduction followed by a future metric for determining return on investment. I think that is what makes the most sense to me.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Does anyone else want to make a comment now, or are we good to take like a 5-minute break so I can just make some real quick tweaks to the presentation and then we'll be right back at it? Does that sound good for everyone? Oh, Shannon? You can.
I was just trying to give a thumbs up. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so that sounds like a vote for a 5-minute break. So let's come back at 1:25 or 6-minute break. Let's come back at 1:26 and or 20. Oh my gosh. Let's go back at 1:25 and we'll continue on this. So, if you have any thoughts, please save them for when we come back. And we'll see you in just a few minutes. All right. So hopefully folks are back and hopefully everyone can see the slide that we left off on. Is that what everyone is experiencing? Okay, good.
Yep,
Thank you.
that's my reality.
Thank you. Thank you for confirming. Okay, so let's get into these scenarios and see what they actually look like in terms of dollar amounts. So first, we're going to look at scenario 1. So now we have applied those legislative rankings to them. So, you can see Sint and Josephine are tied for first based on that legislative priority ranking, and Deschutes and Jackson are second. In this scenario, we've applied a 45% budget reduction to all of the remaining asks. So that's also incorporating in those staff recommended adjustments that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And if we apply that 45% reduction to the adjusted ask, everyone can get funded. And we also have about $599,660 left over. So the option here would be to apply that leftover money, that excess money, to the top 1 or 2 ranked applicants. And it looks like Sunny's hand was up.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed probably 2 or 3, and I didn't make note of it, said that if they had, the applicant said that if they had a 45% reduction, they just wouldn't have the program at all.
Yep.
And so I'm really concerned about cutting, basically by doing this, cutting a program in a county. And so I'm wondering if we can, I don't think any of these scenarios took that into account.
So we did discuss it with our staff. Unfortunately, there were some counties, as you mentioned, that noted that on their prioritization sheet. Columbia County was one of them. They said if they did a 45% cut, which this might be slightly over 45% cut because we did have those staff adjustments as well, that they wouldn't be able to operate. Jackson County was another one. Their cut is also going to be above 45% in this scenario because they did have staff recommended cuts too, especially that adjustment to shorten the project period. However, if we cut those programs less than 45%, we are left with a significant amount of money still to cut. In this scenario, we could potentially, the GRC could recommend to do the 45% cut reduction across the board, the 45% reduction across the board, and then take those $599,660 and apply them to the 3 programs that said they couldn't operate at 45%. That is an option too. But doing a lower percentage reduction for those programs just didn't math out. Kathy?
I have a big concern with that whole across the board 45% reduction, especially like in counties like Jackson, Josephine counties, because this is my fear, that when we do 5% reduction, the illegal growers are also going to know that they've received that level of funding reduction. And the level, I think, of like human trafficking, human suffering, environmental, that is all just going to blow up again. So that is my biggest concern, especially like in Jackson, Josephine counties or on the South Coast. I'm not sure that that's the best way we should approach this.
Okay, so it sounds like you would be more in favor of some of the scenarios we'll look at later where Either the funding is scaled based on the legislative priority ranking, or not all programs are funded. Because those would be some of the alternatives to this scenario, this funding scenario.
Yes, I agree. I agree with some of the other funding mechanisms.
Okay, and we'll look at those too. Sunny, that was a great point. It is also possible with this particular funding scenario that some of those programs will come back to us and say, this is too little, we can't sustain our personnel. And then we would have to determine what to do with those funds. Any other comments or questions about this scenario? I do want to note, these are, we went through the process of applying these different scenarios based on these different concepts. You can come up with an alternate recommendation that's not captured like specifically in one of these scenarios. So just please keep that in mind as well. Like if, everyone was on board for funding all the programs at a 45% reduction, and then somehow adjusting for certain applicants, that is something we could discuss too. So I think I saw Tim's hand up next, and then Rob.
Yeah, thanks. No, I was, as I'm sitting here looking through this, I try to compare this to some of the other grant funding formulas that I've seen come across the board. Did we take into account in any of these, like meet a minimum threshold of a ranking of the score? Like some of these grant applications I see come through that if you are below 75% or whatever of the ranking on the score, just purely based off of funding, your application's not considered. I don't know if that's something that was applied.
Scenario 3 and 4 will be much more in line with that. So that those scenarios, we're not talking about funding everyone. So the folks that are ranked lower would not receive funding.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I think Rob, you had your hand up as well.
And I could easily just take it down and shorten it up because we haven't seen all your scenarios. And before I say this scenario, I want to preface it by saying I'm not pushing or supporting it, but I think a potential scenario is to fund current service level until the money runs out. And I think that would be about a little over a year in that. And I say that because there is a potential, and I'll talk about this briefly, that the legislature could provide more funding for the IMM EGP. I think the chance of getting any general fund dollars out of the legislature in the 2026 short session for the IMM EGP is close to zero. However, there are other plans. There will be legislation to fund it at an enhanced level through other mechanisms. And if I were 100% convinced that legislation was going to pass, I would suggest we fund everything at CSL for now and see what the legislature does. But I am not that confident. So I just wanted to check to see if there is a scenario in which we essentially continue on with current service level until the money runs out.
We did not do that scenario. We could do a calculation like that based on like percent of the current funds now, and then apply that to this funding. But we did not prepare that scenario. We only prepared scenarios for the full biennium. But let's continue talking through what we have here, and then if we need to, we can take a break and try and figure that out. Okay, so the second scenario is very similar to the first one. This is to fund some of the applications. So as you can see, the two lowest scoring applications kind of fell off. They would not be funded in this scenario. And then everyone else gets that 45% budget reduction across the board. And basically what this looks like is there's more, there's
Yeah.
1.875 million that's remaining now because those two applications aren't being funded. And that money can get routed back to potentially the highest scoring applicants. Or, highest need or whatever you folks determine that that method to be. So that's funding scenario 2. Again, very similar to the first one. We just aren't funding everyone. There's more left over, so we can give that additional funding to the highest ranking folks. Scenario funding 3 is more of a scaled reduction based on rank. So like I said previously, the 3 scenarios we asked for from our applicants were 15%, 30%, and 45%. So basically in this scenario 3, the highest ranking applicants, which would be Sint and Josephine, they would get awarded for what was in their 15% scenario minus the staff recommended adjustments. The middle ranking folks would get 30% budget reduction, and then everyone that's remaining would get 45% budget reduction. And then in this scenario, we're still not funding the 2 lowest ranking. In this scenario, because those top ranking folks got a higher percentage of their initial ask, we would have to cut just a minimal amount still. We would have about $3,000 that would need to come out of somewhere, maybe the Douglas County, who is listed as the lowest ranking on this list, still getting funded, or whatever method you folks would think is appropriate to reduce by that $3,000. So that's scenario 3. And in this case, again, we're focusing in on those legislative priorities, and we're essentially putting the most funding towards programs that exhibit those priorities the best. And then scaling the funding from there. So that's scenario 3. And then scenario 4 is really what the most extreme opposite of funding everyone is just funding based on what their adjusted ask is. So incorporating those staff recommended changes, funding the full amount until we run out of funds for the starting with the highest ranking and going down the list. So based on that, we would get to Klamath County. So only the top 3 ranked, which is actually 5 programs, but since they're tied, several of them are tied for different positions. So that would mean, Lane, Clackamas, Douglas, Lamb Hill, and Columbia are not funded. Only those top 5 are. And then we would have a slight surplus of about $215,911 that could go back to one of those higher ranked folks. So those are the scenarios that we prepared. Just looking at, different options from funding everyone to funding until the highest ranking until we run out of funding, and then several options in between. So do people have thoughts, comments, alternative funding strategies? Chris?
Yeah, I want to go back to the previous 2. And for some reason, I'm just curious as to the reasoning why Yamhill and Columbia County would not be funded in those 2 scenarios.
So this
And what-
was, yeah, so for the ones where we didn't fund all applicants, when staff discussed it, those were the 2 applicants that scored kind of significantly lower than the rest of the pool. So St. Josephine, Deschutes, and Jackson all came in very close to the top in all, whether we're looking at total score or just focusing in on the legislative priorities, they're within a couple of points of each other. Then there's the middle folks, and Klamath is in that group too. Then there's the middle folks who were all at about 75% of points possible. And then Yamhill and Columbia were consistently at about 60% of points possible. So there's just a big gap there. So it became a cutoff point, but it doesn't have to be. That's just one that was logical based on how the points fell out across the board.
And that really was just based on the quality of the application that was submitted, correct?
Yes.
So I'm gonna throw one more thing out here, and I'm probably not gonna make any friends here as well. But in my mind, when we've taken, or there's so much less money being applied to this program, and really I've heard nothing saying that anybody should be eliminated from consideration except for an evaluation of the quality of the application itself. Which I'm not sure is an established criteria to be able to make a decision from. The next thing is why, what logic is there in expanding the program by adding a grantee that has never been applied, maybe has been applied, but hasn't been funded in previous years. So there's really no way to make a good assessment of what it is that's in the application itself. And the other comment I'm going to make as well is when you're looking at this type of a budget cut, it's pretty hard to, with what we're given to work with, it's pretty tough to make a lot of decisions about what's best for those at the top, those at the bottom. And I'm still going to advocate for really looking hard at the 45% across the board, the board cut. We all know that these things come and we've got to make tough decisions, but agencies also have to make some tough decisions about what they're doing. And I would much rather see agencies have the opportunity then to adjust their budget to meet what they feel their needs are based on the amount of money that's involved.
So in your, based on your comments, would you then take Clackamas County out of the running and just have the 45% applied to all of the remaining law enforcement agencies, or would you include them in the award list?
That would be a decision point that we would need to make as a group as to whether or not that would be something that could be done, depending on what our philosophy is going to be. But that's one thing that I haven't seen in here or talked about, so I want to bring it up.
Yeah, so this is based on, again, the application criteria specifically comes from the rules for this program, which is, it outlines exactly what we have available to us to make the determinations. The rules say we need to review this information, which is the legislative and commission priorities and anything else included in the application. We didn't include other data points in the application, so we can't make a decision based on them at this point in time. So that's really what we have to make that decision.
No, and I totally understand that. That's not, I'm not throwing or pointing any fingers at anybody. I'm just kind of outlining what the reality is and how honestly difficult it is to make decisions based on those particular things.
Yeah, it is. It is very difficult. And I think it's, with such large funding deficits across the board statewide, I think along with, HB 3069, which is going to consolidate all our grants, CJC is really looking internally to figure out better processes to add more data and better align, some of this rules language with what we actually want to have in front of us to make those decisions. So that's definitely something we have felt as well.
Yeah, the other thing I'll point out were Rob's comments too. It sounds like there may be a crack in the door for funding later on prior to the end of the biennium. So
Yeah.
something should be considered. And I know there's no guarantees. Trust me, I know there's no guarantees in that scenario, but it's an opening.
Yes. And Sunny, it looks like you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is Sunny with the Department of Ag. I have serious heartburn about making a recommendation that eliminates 2 counties, especially, I have questions about Columbia County being a county that has ports on the Columbia River and potential for shipping. Um, I did some back of the envelope math, and if 3 counties basically said it at 45% cut, they would cut their programs. That was Sint, Klamath, and Columbia. If we drop their cut to 30%, we'd have a little over 78,000 that would still need to be cut.
Mm-hmm.
I would just really encourage us to look at percentages that take into account all 8 applicants.
Yeah, Jackson County also included some comments in their budget scenarios that if they reduced, I think more than that 15%, I'd have to go back and double check, but I think it was
They
at the
said
15% scenario, then they would drop their productivity down to less than 30% of
13.
what it is now. So
Well, they
that's,
didn't say they'd cut their program. They said they would cut back the operation period.
yeah.
So I
Which,
felt like that was maybe a little bit different conversation since you already cut back their operation period.
yeah. I just want to, if we're taking into consideration those comments, we should do it across the board for everyone. But if you feel that comment is in a different vein than the 3 other programs you mentioned, absolutely, they can be dealt with differently if we want to move forward with that methodology. So I guess what is being proposed there is we would do a 45% cut for anyone that could sustain it, drop to 30% for the 3 programs that could not sustain their program any further. And then we would still need to make about, what was it, 750,000? I can do the math.
78 or 79,000
So,
split among the other remaining folks.
yeah. So what do folks think about that proposed funding scenario? So it's sort of this scenario 1 plus some additional considerations. So instead of having surplus funding at the end, we still have about 80,000 to cut. Anyone have thoughts on that? And again, if you're a member of the public, we'll have a public comment period at the end. Tyler?
Yeah, I'm really struggling with any scenario that doesn't drop the 45% reduction across the board. And I understand some teams have expressed that they couldn't continue, and I'm not looking to eliminate any teams. The exact opposite. But I think applying that 45% across the board, if programs look at the number at the end of the day and aren't able to continue, I'd like to see that then go back into the remaining teams. But I just don't, I'm struggling with a way to make this even, and I just don't see that there's a way to do it.
I mean, we do in this 45% reduction scenario, we have 599,600 surplus. So potentially, instead of adding that allocation or adding that to the allocation for the top scorer, it could be split between those counties that self-identified as not being able to continue. That is a possibility. But again, it depends on where you folks are at with that. Tyler?
Yeah, but I guess that question probably wasn't posed equally to everybody. Like, at what point can you no longer continue to provide a team? I think those teams self-identified, but I don't think that everybody was asked to, where their threshold is. So I think that complicates things, adding that 600,000 back to those three teams that self-identified, because I can imagine some people that prepared the grant saying, well, wait a second, we forgot to say that we'd also have a challenge at this percentage reduction too.
Yeah. I did communicate that, to please note that on the forum, to anyone that I spoke with, and I think in the webinar as well, but whether or not everyone across the board did it, I can't say, so. So far, just based on the general conversation, it sounds like we have had more people in favor of this scenario 1. But I just want to do a temperature check. I don't know, maybe, Rob mentioned another scenario of looking at CSL and then just potentially running out of funds in a year. We could take a break and calculate that. Alternatively, we could take a vote now to, apply one of these scenarios. It's really up to you folks, but it sounds like there are several different, ideas on the board, but folks are mostly leaning towards the 45% reduction, with a few folks leaning more towards not funding everyone and having the higher ranked people get a higher percentage of their adjusted ask. So, Tim?
Yeah, and I'll preface this again with, it's my goal to try to advocate for every sheriff's office that has applied for funding. But in talking or listening to Chris Gibson's conversation, and maybe a little bit of Rob Bovet's concept of current service level, I'm curious what a current service level would look like with no new applications applied. I would hate to say that we need to eliminate anybody from any of the programs, but it's unfortunate that we're in this particular position, but you have counties that have continued to produce and continued to work hard at this for several years. And I just know, in talking with a lot of my sheriffs, that yeah, it may not have been clear on their application, but you give them a 45% reduction, even trying to ask them to offset it and try to modify their work productivity, they just aren't able to function in a safe and normal manner. And so you may see, even, if we were to do 45% reduction across the board with a little bit kickback on a few or a handful of counties, you're still going to see a huge significant impact. And either way, the message needs to be sent back to the legislature that if this is a priority, we need to make sure we can find a way to continue to fund it at a level that we need it, because obviously the workload that we have in the community across the state does not match the amount of funds that are coming in.
Yeah. And it looks like Tyler's hand's up again.
Yeah, I just want to go out. New grantee term has come up a couple of times, and I just feel like I need to defend Clackamas County, and I'm not sure why. As far as cannabis work is concerned, they've been a great ally to the state police, and they've provided people every time that we've asked, and just been all in with cannabis over the last 5 years. So for them to just be jumping in now, I'm not sure what that decision was, why they didn't jump in earlier. I know Washington County is jumping out, and it's kind of a net zero from what Washington County was getting in this proposed reduction. So I just feel the need to jump in and say, there's a need in every one of these counties that's asking for money. And again, it may not have been demonstrated because they might not have been in the grant program the last few years, but it's still there. And I just would hate to eliminate them just because they held out for as long as they could, and now they're asking. Just my 2 cents there.
Thank you. It looks like Shannon's hand is up as well.
Yeah, I would like some clarification, and I'm really sorry, Rima, if I just kind of missed this, but at the end of this 24 month period, we are expecting that there will continue to be funding available for this, right? We don't have any reason to think that's not going to be the case. We just don't know how much.
Right, so we have the 6 million per
Yeah.
biennium allocation that's just always there, and then in the last few years, we've received additional funds on top of that. And then,
Okay.
of course, this year we have some rollover funds as well. But that 6 million is just the base level. Obviously, it's much less than what the ask is, but we would have at least that much.
Okay, I just wanted to get some clarity on that piece. And the reason is that I think I'd like to fund everybody. I definitely want to defer, I think, to the law enforcement professionals who've made some really good points here. I think the 2 things that stand out to me, because we do grants, as you know, at DOJ all the time, is that when we do have these significant funding shortages, sometimes like difficult decisions need to be made in order to ensure that the people who receive the funding can actually work with what they have. I don't know if the application really covered that, but my concern, I think, about the idea of current service level until it ends is that the cost of ramping back up, if some of these teams have to let go some or all, then the cost to ramp back up far exceeds the minimal amount of money that's going to be available in the next go around. So I know it's kind of an untenable balancing, but it does seem like it's really in the best interest of teams to get them funding that will take them through the funding period, and to figure out what that amount is, even though they're going to have to reduce size, rather than just saying spend it in 12 months to stay at a current level and then not be able to actually refund the team when we don't expect there's going to be a huge infusion of money down the road. So unfortunately, I don't have a solution. I definitely want to defer. I just am concerned about the idea of having people spend and then having it all go away and not being able to actually pick this up at all in the next go around.
Looks like Aaron, your hand is up next.
Well, I thank you, Rima. I just I find myself agreeing as usual with everything that people have said for certainly the different reasons, and certainly what Shannon just said is absolutely correct. And I certainly defer to everyone here in terms of being far more expert than me on the economics of cannabis, on the economics of law enforcement, and certainly people who are applying for these grants know their individual economics in their counties. But but what I do feel comfortable saying is that whether it's this operation or any law enforcement or prosecution operation, this business is a lot more expensive than people are willing to admit, and especially combating illegal marijuana. And it's a lot more expensive than people are even asking for. And so I want people to have the funds that they need to at least try to make it. And I think what Shannon said is correct. If you don't have the funds to at least have some operation going, the ability to get one going at some point is really, really expensive. So I want these operations to be able to continue to be successful, competitive, and these operations maybe are trying to start up for the first time to be able to get going in a meaningful way, and hopefully they'll continue to be funded in the future. Because if we're going to certainly have a legitimate, credible, lawful cannabis sales operation in Oregon, we have to defeat the illegal operations in every way possible. And it's a lot more expensive and involves some tactics and methods that are really, really intense. And so I know none of this money is enough to do it in ways that I think people truly need. So this is not as much as people want or need in these areas, but it's something to help. So I do support the getting money to everybody in some fashion. So that's where I am. Sorry, it's a long answer to get where people are moving towards, but thank you for letting me unload a little bit on that.
This is a difficult and very important conversation, so I think we want to make sure every viewpoint is considered. It looks like Tyler's hand is up again. Did you have something to add, Tyler? Oh, I think you're muted still.
Thank you, Rima. I just wanted to point out a fundamental difference, just to kind of counterpoint to the last two comments. With a grant program and ramping up, if you were looking at the current funding status model or current service level model and ramping back up, just a thought here is, these are all police agencies, and all of them except for Yamhill just got a regular drug program, a regular drug team back up and running again. Columbia County doesn't have a regular drug team without this money, but every other team on here, as I look at it, they have established drug teams. So really what we're talking about here is a capacity to investigate cannabis. These cannabis grant teams in most cases are going to sit alongside the regular drug teams. So we're talking about an increased capacity to investigate cannabis as opposed to all other drug crimes, right? So if this funding goes away, obviously the cannabis crimes still exist. It still is a problem that has to be dealt with in some way. The level of efficiency that it gets dealt with is what we're talking about here in my mind. And in some cases, that will mean that there's just nobody to deal with the cannabis crime, because on the scale of priorities, we're going to be looking at a drug crime that has more of a public safety impact, or whatever reason it might be with that team. But I just want to be clear here that it's not ramping up a program from zero if the money runs out. There's still police officers, they're still investigating, and they're still investigating drug crimes in a lot of cases. It's just the dedicated individuals to cannabis that we're talking about. So the investigation doesn't go away if the money goes away, I guess is what I'm saying. It just becomes increasingly less productive.
Yeah, and what we've heard from grantees over and over and over again is that it's such a different and time-consuming investigation compared to a lot of other types of investigations, that their ability to do those is just severely hampered or not there without these funds. I don't know if that helped clarify anything or just added more complicating information. So I think at this point, maybe, there's a lot to consider. There's considerations on both sides of either funding all programs or only funding some of them. So maybe that should be our first vote is, maybe we can vote whether we want to fund all the programs, and then the second part of the conversation after we determine yes or no is just to revisit the percentage, the 45% cuts, since we have heard, a couple different ways that those cuts could be applied for the grantees. So with your guys' permission, and if you guys think it's appropriate, do you mind doing a vote now on whether basically to adopt or not adopt this scenario where we're funding all of the applicants? Does that seem appropriate to folks? Or we can continue discussing all the different scenarios too, if we're not ready to take a vote at this time.
I think it seems appropriate. What would we be voting on not funding?
So this vote, the way I see it, the first vote is to vote whether to fund all applicants. And if that passes, it would be to determine, you know, whether this 45% reduction is appropriate or some other reduction level. And if it doesn't pass, then we would move on to the next scenario. And Aaron, did you have something to say?
No, I was just gonna answer your question. I think we should take a vote, kind of move things forward.
Okay, excellent. So let's go ahead and take a vote. So we're not necessarily voting on whether to implement the 45% reduction across the board. What we're voting on now is whether we want to have some level of funding for all of the applicants. Sunny?
I just was voting yes. I don't know how you want us to do the vote.
I can go ahead and read your name. Let's do a roll call vote, just since this is one of the big decision points. So Rob, what is your vote?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And Tim
Yes.
and Chris,
Yes.
Rosie, are you still with us, Rosie?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
okay. Thank you. Sunny?
Yes.
Okay. Kathy?
Yes.
All right. Shannon?
Yes.
Yes. And then Aaron?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And then Tyler?
Yes.
Great. So the next decision point, I think, is if we want to apply this 45% reduction across the board and then take that remainder and give it to, you know, either the highest scoring or some of those folks that indicated they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves, or due to some other percentage reduction. So what are thoughts on that?
Does it not come out more even if it's reduced, say, by 44%? I'm sorry, I'm not able to do math on the fly.
Let me see if I can do that for you. I'm not sure I can do math on the fly either, but we'll try to figure it out.
I guess what I'm getting at is there an even percentage reduction
Where there's no remainder.
or little? Yes.
Okay, so let's see. We do adjusted ask. Next. Thank you for your patience as I try and do math. If we did, I also talk to myself while I'm doing things, so I apologize. Okay, so 44%, we have slightly less remainder, so I would say %42 cut. If we did a 42% cut, we would have $76,442 over, or remainder, excuse me. If we go any further than that, then we would need to cut additional funds. So we could potentially do a 42% cut instead of a 45% reduction across the board. And then we would just have $76,000 to give back to somebody. How do people feel about that scenario? Getting a thumbs up?
Sorry, I didn't want to complicate things, but it just makes more sense to go across the board. It seems a little simpler than adding more back into the better ranked applications, but I'm kind of ambivalent between the two different scenarios as far as the extra going back in or the across the board even reduction.
Okay, so in either case, I mean, I guess the concept here was we give everyone the same budget reduction and then we're rewarding the top ranked. We could put that, if we did a 42% reduction, we could take that $76,000 and again, we could give it to the highest ranking folks, or we could give it to somebody else, since there is that little bit of remainder. Anyone have strong thoughts either way on whether to do 45% cut, which was, or 45% reduction, which was what was identified in the application and the scenario that the grantees submitted to us. That's why we went with that number, or to change it a little bit and do a 42% reduction and have slightly less remainder. Any thoughts on that? Tim?
I would say that if the only metric we're looking at is just reducing everybody across the board by a percentage, I think reducing them by 42% to make it as less painful as possible, I guess.
Okay, so that's two folks for changing the percentage. So Sunny, did you have a comment?
I agree. And
Okay.
you probably dump it into an Excel spreadsheet and fiddle with it until you get as close to zero as possible for all the counties.
Yeah, we could do that. So if we just want to do the same percentage across the board, that's at $2,000. So if we did 41.65, wait a minute, I can't. I think it's 41.65. One moment. So just adjusting, you know, the percentage just slightly. 5.85. So it's to 41.55%, we go down to about $2,000 under. So somewhere right in there, between 41 and 42, until we, you know, whatever minuscule part of a percentage we need to get to until we zero out is what I'm hearing you want to do. So everyone just gets the same percentage across the board. And that percentage is somewhere between 41 and 42% reduction of whatever needs to be to zero out. And I'm seeing some thumbs up. Rosie, did you have your hand up? Feel free to jump in if you do have a comment, Rosie.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I agree with that approach.
Okay, excellent. So, okay. See if we can just do that real quick. Oh, that's over, so 4. If you'll give me just a second, I'll see if I can figure out what that percentage is. No, that's too much. 4. Now we can get a revised funding table up for you folks. So just to make sure we can figure out what that exact percentage is to zero out, I recommend taking like a 10-minute break here, and then we'll figure out that exact percentage and have a funding table up for you guys. And then at that point, we can take a vote to show that you approve those dollar amounts for each of the applicants, if you guys don't mind. So we'll come back at 2:25 if that works for you guys. And thank you for bearing with us. This is with all the breaks and everything. We just want to make sure we can incorporate all your feedback and get to the dollar amounts. So our recommendations are very accurate. So on that note, we'll come back at 2:25. See you in a few minutes. All right, we were back, and I apologize for the few minutes of lateness, and also the formatting of this table is not ideal. But basically, the closest I could get was with a remainder of $649.54, applying a reduction of 41.55745% to everyone's remaining ask. So again, we can go ahead and take a vote on this, including what to do with this tiny remainder we have. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Rima. Yeah, so I've been sitting here thinking about this as we've been discussing all this, and while I appreciate the desire to try to go straight across the board, which at the end of the day, anything's better than nothing. So I would support that. However, I just want to make sure that's on the record that it somewhat eliminates the competitiveness completely out of this process, that this process was designed to be competitive in nature. There's a reason for the application process to be scored and ranked, which I agree with Tyler. Not sure exactly how all these get ranked. I think every single one of the communities deserves and needs this funding. However, this would be more of just a straight across the board cut across, no matter how you ranked and no matter how competitive you were for this process.
Thank you for that. Kathy, it looks like your hand is also up.
And I wish it would have been based on previous, or more of the focus of this would have been based on previous outcomes. Because right as it is, I mean, I've gone through and I've like costed out like what it costs per bust and things, and some of them are like $6,000, and some of them are like 50, 70, $80,000. So to me, that just doesn't. I wish that had been a much stronger piece in this whole decision.
Thank you. It looks like Tyler's hand is up as well.
Yeah, I've got to echo Kathy's sentiment there and nod to Tim. I agree. It does take the competitive part out of this, and I don't want to minimize CJC's staff work on that and in ranking the applications, but at the same time, it doesn't adjust for newness to the program. For one, the lower ranking are the newer teams. And then it doesn't also account for that return on investment or the outcomes. So if we just look at the application itself, we leave those things on the table.
Thank you for that comment. Anything else? So at this point, do we want to go ahead and take a vote whether or not to apply this 41.55745% reduction across the board? The alternative would be, since we already voted to fund everyone, to do some kind of scaled funding, which does take into consideration the ranking. For example, we would need to make an adjustment to the scenario 3, but we could do something similar to this scaled ranking. If we did that, we would add the Yamhill and Columbia back in, since we've already determined we want to fund everyone, and then the percentage reductions for the lower ranking ones would probably need to be higher than 45 to zero out. So do folks have thoughts on that, whether we want to vote on this adjusted percentage reduction of remaining ask or apply some other scaled methodology to it? Are we guess we'll just pause for a second and see if anyone has comments one way or the other. Okay, since no one seems to be speaking up right now, it might be appropriate to just vote on this percentage, and we can see through the voting whether we're going to move forward with the across the board 41.55745% reduction, or if we need to explore other options. So I'll go ahead and do roll call again so we can get a vote on that. So Rob?
I'm sorry, Rima, I just stepped back in after, can you actually reverse the order of calling and I'll catch up with you here?
Sure.
I don't want to be the first to vote all day long either, by the way.
That's fair. So again, the vote here is whether to apply the 41.55745% reduction across all applicants. And if the vote succeeds, we'll have our allocation for the legislative for the law enforcement applicants. And if it does not succeed, then we'll continue the conversation and maybe look at a different funding strategy that does maybe scaled percentage funding based on the ranking. So I'll start on the other side of our list, our GRC list. So Tyler, you're up first.
Well, I think I opened the 41.55745% can of worms, so I will absolutely vote yes.
Okay. And Aaron?
Yes.
And Shannon?
Yes.
And Kathy?
No.
And Sunny?
Yes.
And Rosie? And Rosie, are you still with us? Oh, looks like she just stepped out, so we'll come back to her. Chris?
Yes.
Tim?
Yes, with a caveat. Once we hear public comment, is there a way to possibly adjust what we're thinking? Because I'm curious as to if there's any sheriffs on the call that would have comment on moving forward, but I would say yes for now.
Okay. And Rosie? Are you back with us? Rosie? Nope. And Rob?
Well, waiting the 5 minutes didn't really help me much because I don't like either option. But I think since Tim did that, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to ditto on Tim and say yes with a caveat. I do want to hear what others have to think because I don't like either of these options.
Okay, I mean, we have the public comment period scheduled for after the CBO discussion. We could table this for now. You know, we had enough votes to pass it, but we could table it and come back at the end after we've talked through the CBO applications and heard public comment. If folks are on board for that, we can do that. As it stands now, we have enough votes to pass this scenario.
I support
I like
tabling it
tabling.
pending public comment.
Okay, that
Rima,
sounded like a
this-
yes.
And
Yes.
Rima, this is Shannon. I do as well, although I have to step away at 3 o'clock. And I'll be
Okay.
gone for 20 minutes or so if the meeting is still continuing.
Yeah, I'm guessing since it's 2:38 now that we will run past 3. Are you gonna be able to come back on?
Yes, but I have a meeting. I have, it's urgent and I have to be there from 3 to 3:20 or so.
3 to 3:20. Okay. All right, we'll try and move quickly. It should be a little bit easier conversation because we've looked at all of these options and we're just applying it to the CBO applicants. So let's just go ahead and table this vote for now and then move on to the CBO applicants and see if we can come back to it within time for Shannon to participate. So Safety Compass, their program goal is to coordinate with partner agencies to lead trainings, chair labor trafficking subcommittees within the human trafficking task forces, and conduct outreach to connect with victims with trauma-informed, culturally and linguistically responsive services. Their request is for $202,302, and they scored 82% of points possible. Their adjusted request just adjusted down a little bit to 191,928, mostly based off of an adjustment of their administrative cost, which was higher than is allowable. That's Safety Compass. Cannabis Workers Resiliency Project, they operate statewide. Unlike most of our other programs, their goal is to address the humanitarian crisis caused by Oregon's illegal cannabis market by supporting workers, promoting accountability, and preventing the exploitation of low-wage and immigrant cannabis workers through economic support, mental health services, outreach, and other services. Their request was for $2,820,835, and they scored 78% of points possible. And their budget didn't end up getting reduced based on those staff recommended reductions. So they're at the full amount of their requested funds to 820,835. Our last CBO applicant is JBAR-J. Their goal is to deliver crisis intervention, long-term case management, and culturally responsive outreach and training to improve the identification of service connections for victims of labor exploitation and trafficking in Central Oregon. Their request is for $482,267, and they received 71% of points possible. Their request was adjusted based on a number of months requested and a few other things like the training reduction. So their adjusted ask is 400,714. So for them, we set up the same scenarios as we previously discussed. So what those would look like are if we funded all three, and again, because of the legislative priority ranking, CWRP, jumps up to number 1, Safety Compass number 2, and JBAR-J number 3. So based on funding all three of them, then we would, be able to do a 45% reduction across the board, and we would have a remainder of $329,609 that we could, apply to CWRP, or we could do a similar exercise as what we did for law enforcement and see exactly what that percentage cut would need to be to zero out. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2 would be to not fund all of them and fund a higher percentage of their adjusted ask. That's scenario 2. Scenario 3 is similar. It's actually funding all three of them, but applying a scaled reduction based on their legislative priority ranking. So for that one, again, we would have a remainder of 545, 430, 27 that we could apply back to our highest ranking applicant. And then scenario 4, we just did a sample scenario where we just funded the top ranking applicant at as much of their ask as we possibly could. And their ask was over the amount set aside for CBOs, so we would need to do a $613,813 reduction if we chose to just fund the top ranking CBO. So do you folks, would you like to discuss those scenarios and what makes the most sense for those CBO applicants? I went through that very quickly. We can flip back to any of those slides to look at them. Rob, your hand is up. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. First, I wanted to note for the record, I do have to, much like Shannon, have to go to a call I have to take at 4 o'clock. I'll be back. It just probably will take 20 minutes or so, right
Okay.
at 4 o'clock, just a note for the record. My question on this one is, because I think we have two service providers currently, is there any overlap of service territory between, it's easy for me to understand counties, but I don't understand exactly by the names who's serving what area. You showed a nice map for J Bar J, but maybe it was too fast. I didn't understand. Is there any overlap here?
Yeah, so we're funding all three of them currently. They are returning applicants. So if we Safety Compass covers
Okay.
this area shown here.
Got it.
CWRP is statewide, although they do have the majority of their activity kind of in Southern Oregon, but they do provide services statewide. And then JBAR-J is Central Oregon.
Central Oregon, right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I think Kathy was next.
When do we need to express our conflict of interest?
When we do, well, you can express it now and then just, if we do any voting, just, and I call out your name, just state that you have a conflict at that point and you're abstaining.
Okay, all right.
And I think Chris is next.
Yep, I was just gonna cut to the chase and advocate for an across the board percentage cut, just like we did with the law enforcement group.
Okay. So that would be something like this, where we could either take that remainder, that overage of $329,000 odd and either give it back to CWRP or adjust the percentage like we did with the law enforcement folks to be as close to zero as possible.
Adjust the percentage to get to as close to zero as we can.
Okay, so same methodology. All right. Any other comments?
I think that probably that makes the most sense when it comes to like fairness. It is interesting to me though that the cuts sustained to programs 2 and 3, which are also currently still currently in the funding pool, could mostly be mitigated by that extra surplus amount.
You mean by cutting
Yeah,
45% across the board and then taking that 329 and giving it back to Safety Compass
that's
and
what
JBAR-J?
I was wondering about what that 45%, where exactly it came from, and you just expressed it. Yeah, I think that what Chris just said is probably the most accurate. It's interesting because there's such a huge, I realize it's statewide, but there's such a huge disparity between the funding amounts, and that 45% then almost brings the other two programs up to whole in the the discrete areas they serve. I don't know that there's a particularly good justification for doing that. It's just kind of ironic, I guess, that the application of that cut matches the actual cuts those programs are taking, if that makes sense.
The CWRP project is substantially larger. It is that partnership of 6 CBO agencies, which is part of the reason why the funding disparity exists. It's 6 agencies versus 1 agency with like 1 single personnel cost. Sunny, your hand was up.
Along those same lines, I was looking at what if we funded JBAR-J and Safety Compass at 100% and then just subtracted that amount from the total. That would leave CWRP with a little over 1.7. So kind of along the same lines, and would only be a 61% cut for them, but would fund those smaller groups at 100% of their ask. Now, is that the right way? Is that appropriate? I don't know, but that was another way I was looking at it.
Thank you for that. So, so far we've had, 1 person at least advocate for doing the percentage cut, the same percentage cut across the board for everyone, which would be slightly less than 45. And we've also heard not cutting Safety Compass and JBAR-J as little as possible and making the reductions primarily to the CWRP budget. So do you folks have thoughts on which one of those pathways is more appropriate? And Chris, it looks like your hand is up.
Yeah, sorry, I did this actually before we met, and I was looking at this, and just an across the board cut based on percentage that's fairly allocated was at 37% instead of 45%.
Okay.
Yeah. And that gives CWRP like 1.773, JBAR-J 303,000, and Safety Compass 127 plus a little bit.
So would your vote or your recommendation be for that percentage cut as well, which is across the board percentage rather than?
Yes. And I'm sorry I didn't bring that up earlier. I just noticed it was the 45.
No, thank you for doing the math for us. We appreciate it. So anyone else that does not agree with what sounds like to be the more of the consensus at this point, which is to do equal cuts across the board for all three applicants? Tyler?
Yeah, I just go on record as saying I support the equal across the board cut. But I'd really like to be looking at performance metrics right now to help me with my decision, and I hope we're able to do that next time.
Heard and felt as well. Kathy?
Yeah, I want to second what Tyler said because I think that it becomes very obvious how the funds and things were spent when we look at outcomes.
Thank you, Kathy. Any other comments at this time? Okay. So it sounds like folks are leaning towards this, I guess, 37% reduction across the board. We can, make adjustments to our table so we can show the correct amount to do a vote. So since we're kind of in the same place as for the law enforcement applications, and we're getting very close to 3 p.m., do we want to go ahead and do our public comment period now? So everyone can hear those comments? I'm not seeing any no's. Oh, Rob?
Oh, I was just going to say yes.
Okay, thank you for responding. All right, so we're going to go ahead and shift to public comment, and we'll come back to the voting after the public comment period. So public comment. So starting at 2:52, we have 5 minutes set aside. So, please, if you're a member of the public and you have a comment, please raise your hand, and we'll try and get to everyone in our 5 minutes. So does anyone want to make a public comment? China, looks like your hand was up first.
Yeah, I just did the back of the napkin math related to the reduction across the board, and it's not the same as what number you came up with, so I would just want to make sure that whatever the reduction is the appropriate amount.
Thank you for that comment. Nate?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm Sheriff Nate Stickler down in Jackson County, and I've been listening to this most of the hearing, and I just got to say that I know that the folks on the review board are in a tough position, and the legislature put us in a tough position with the funding that was allocated for this important work. But I will say that based on what I'm hearing today, it feels kind of almost disingenuous to have a process set up that is supposed to be competitive, not only in the grant process of what you submit, but also your history of work. And in Jackson County, we've been spearheading, along with Josephine County, this work since marijuana became legal for recreational. In fact, we've been at the tip of the spear and bearing the brunt of this problem by a large margin. It's not even close. And I respect what Tyler said about you can find the problem anywhere, but no counties have been through what Josephine and Jackson County have been through. And hence, for many years, we're the largest grant recipients, which we're thankful for. But these cuts are going to be detrimental to our service levels and our ability to address this problem. We've done what we said we would do with the money. We have a track record of addressing the problem and making it better. And now it feels like, if this was the approach that the CJC was going to take with how to allocate money, why even put our staff through this work to compile stats and do, agency visits with the CJC and go to all this work and effort to just have a across the board reduction? It seems like that's an easy way out. And, I know everyone's in a tough position, so this is not an attack on any one individual, because I can hear the hesitation for people voting yes for this, because it's like a choice of evils here. But I got to say that this is extremely disheartening to have it come down to all the effort and work that we put in here down in Southern Oregon to be cut across the board with just everybody as if, I get it. You're trying to be fair, but it doesn't seem fair and it doesn't seem right. And it's going to really impact our community in Southern Oregon, who has bared the brunt of this from the beginning, both in workloads and efforts. So for what it's worth, I just think this is not a well set up process. It measures no past performance, statistics, threat assessments, or anything. So I hope this can be adjusted, but unfortunately with these budget reductions, you can't yo-yo a team back and forth. And we've set up a massive team based on our budgetary. And so we lose, positions, which those are not easy to start up. It's a year process, or 15 months at times, to get bodies in place. So anyways, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Sheriff Sickler. Dave, it looks like your hand is also up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for everybody taking the time. Obviously, I'm Sheriff Dave Daniel, Josephine County. This is obviously a very important issue. I can only describe, and I really don't want to walk all over what and repeat exactly what Sheriff Stickler just said, because he was very spot on. I just think this is unfortunate. The way this was conducted. I mean, we are, as Sheriff Stickler said, we are ground zero down here. We have been the tip of the spear. And I'm not going to go over what he said, but this vote will shut us down. My team will cease to exist. Whether I fund them at a level for 2 years, there's maybe a person type thing. I can get in there. I'm going to have to crunch the numbers on that, or fund them for 13, 14 months at full staffing where we actually can be productive. And to this community, to Southern Oregon, that's going to be brutal. It's going to be detrimental. I mean, the other organizations on the other side of the fence, we're not even going to be identifying who they can help. So unfortunate nonetheless. I know we're in a tight spot, and I know we all are, and I know that no one wants this type of a funding reduction to take place, but obviously it is. So we'll do what we can, but it's going to be devastating. Thanks for giving me a few minutes.
Thank you for your comment, and I believe we have one more. Sam?
Yeah, good afternoon. Sam Elliott. I'm the Yamhill County Sheriff. I really do wish, like the others, that we could have looked at overall productivity of the teams historically to have a gauge for what could be expected. It was a very challenging exercise to put together a presentation or an application that took into account a 45% reduction. we went through that exercise. And if you look back historically, you will see that my county in particular, our ask is significantly less before the 45% reduction because we've tried to tailor to our need. But the cyclical nature of these types of cases where we're just now at that 3-year point where you see these organized groups start to come back into properties and places that they were operating in 2022. That just it doesn't take into consideration the nature of this type of work. And I get the funding is there. I will just say that I presented an option of a 45% reduction, and I'm willing to live with that 45% reduction if that in any way helps any of my counterparts down south, because their problem is much more widespread than my problem. It doesn't mean it impacts the community any more or less, but yeah, they're right there and have cases that just make ours not look as severe. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like we're a little over, but we have one more hand up. So Julie, if you can keep your comment, short, be able to hear.
Yes, I'm Julie Samples, and I am with the CWRP, one of the CBOs that has applied. I just wanted to say thank you. And while past performance may not be able to be taken into consideration, just want to urge you all, as you are doing, to look at the impact, potential impact moving forward of the funds. And so I will just keep it short with that. So thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. So with that, it's 3 o'clock. So I think we're gonna lose Shannon at this point in the discussion, unfortunately. So where we were with the law enforcement folks, oops, yeah, sorry, I gotta flip back a little bit. Was looking at whether this 41.55745% reduction of remaining ask, and I do just want to point out this is based on the 45% reduction of the adjusted ask. So that's taking out some of the funds that we showed in those budget tables. So that might be where the math was a little funny for folks. But so doing the 41.55745% reduction of remaining asks across the board for all applicants. And I believe the vote that we had at that time that we paused was whether or not we wanted to apply that. So let's take up our discussion there. Do GRC members have any new considerations based on that public comment? And for reference, when we did that vote, so we had one no, one person that had dropped out of the conversation, and everyone else had voted yes to apply this 41.55745% reduction. Any comments, concerns, or anything else? We can discuss other scenarios.
I'd like to discuss other scenarios, please.
Okay.
Because I think the human impact on victims in this case, people that are going to be trafficked or victims of abuse, coercion, whatever it is, it's going to increase significantly here in Jackson and Josephine County. So I think that we need to take that human impact as well into consideration.
So since we've already determined that we're going to fund everyone, if we were to take into consideration a different funding strategy that would look more like this scenario 3 here, where it's, scaled funding based on the priority ranking. Not necessarily those percentages, but it would be something more like that across the board. Chris, your hand was up as well.
Yeah, and I'm probably skipping ahead in the agenda. Next steps go, but can you tell us if whatever recommendation that we make, they go to the commission, correct? The commission takes those into consideration, can make their own decisions as a result of comments they may hear during a meeting.
That is correct.
Which gives everybody a chance to offer up something different potentially, and then would the commission kick it back with instructions for making different or taking different accounts?
So they have the option to accept whatever recommendation you make, kick it back for additional consideration, or to just make a different decision.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, my dog is barking. I apologize if that's you can hear that. Okay, so we have one person in favor of exploring a different percentage allocation method. Does anyone else want to jump in and say what that might look like, if you're in favor of that, or if you prefer to stick to the across the board percentage cut? All right, so I'm not seeing any hands up. Oh, Tyler, you did put a hand up.
Sorry, I maybe should have put it down. I guess what I'm looking at is I'm trying to think of a fair way to do this, and I can't. I hear the sheriffs from Josephine and Jackson County, and I'm with them. I get what they're saying, but I just don't see a way to do this fairly. Now I understand that there's some teams that are saying that with a 45% reduction, or I guess in this case 41% reduction, they won't be able to continue. I wonder then if what happens to that money, and if we have to go back and reallocate again. Are we going to have this meeting again in advance of the commission's meeting? It just brings up a lot of questions, and that's more of a comment than anything else.
Yeah, so we will take whatever the recommendations that come from today are to the commission in the October commission meeting. So that's just a few weeks away. And then they'll make their decision. If the decision is to award, then at that point, we'll start the contracting process. And if folks decline whatever they were awarded, we would come back again and do another, conversation about what to do with that money that wasn't accepted, through, we could award it through like a supplementary funding process, which is what usually happens. So that's kind of the next steps if the commission, takes the recommendation and makes awards based on it. That is happening just a few weeks from now, so we would be able to get an answer to that question pretty quickly, hopefully. I hope that answered your question. Tim?
Yeah, I'm just kind of circling back on when the CJC reviews our recommendation, is there a competitive criteria that they are taking into account that we would have applied or that they're expecting us to apply to this particular process?
So they'll take, whatever recommendation you have, and they themselves look at all the applications and the scores, and have their own conversation and, decision-making process, to see if what they're thinking aligns with the GRC recommendation. They don't, necessarily go in and rank them themselves, like they wouldn't redo the legislative priority ranking, although they could choose to apply it differently. It really, that option is completely open. They can make a totally different decision than the recommendation. Usually they follow the recommendation because they trust you folks. You're the subject matter experts, but we've seen both things happen. And there isn't necessarily a standard process for it. I'm sorry, I hope that answers your question too.
Yeah, no, it does. I just, because I know that, even Tyler's made a comment, and I know, some of the sheriffs, they really pride themselves on the work that they do, and they work really hard to compete for the dollars that are provided and available. And it just, I would want to make sure that it's clear that if we're going to have a competitive process, I want to, I'm not advocating against in particular one county, but they need to be competing for the money. And in this particular case, they applied, they made some reductions, and now we're cutting everybody's ask to make it work. And it just doesn't feel like it's taking into account the entities that put in the time or effort to jump through this process.
Thank you for that comment. So it sounds to me like we're still kind of weighing things on multiple sides of this decision. It might be good at this point. We did already, like I said, take the vote, and based on, where it stood before the public comment, it would pass that we would apply this across the board reduction. So maybe what we want to do at this point is take that vote again, and then we can move on with the conversation after we kind of make that decision on whether or not to apply this across the board percentage. Are folks on board with that? Okay, I see a thumbs up, so I'm going to take the roll call vote again, and if this is just to see if your positions changed based on that public comment. So we'll start at the bottom of the list again. So Tyler, would you vote to apply this 41.55745% across the board?
Yes, with an explanation that I don't believe this is perfect.
Thank you. Aaron, you're up next.
Sorry, I lost my cursor for a second. I'm going to vote yes, but I really hear what the sheriffs are saying. And, well, I don't agree with every single word the sheriff said, but I feel the strength of their words. And these are recommendations, and we're making. And my feeling is that illegal marijuana is everywhere. But I know that they have done a heck of a job down in Jackson, Josephine, and also in Lane and Shoots and other areas as well. And everything they said, I agree with completely. And I know that my elected colleagues, the district attorneys from those counties, are working hard with them. And so I know these are recommendations, the full CJC, and I'm happy with leaving it at the recommendation. And I think probably the full CJC would want to hear from these sheriffs about their feelings that they've expressed here today, because what they've said today makes a lot of sense to me. But I think everybody needs some financial help. It's not enough for anybody to get this job done. And so I'm going to stick with my original position on this. But I would certainly want them to raise their very well stated position today, again, in front of the full CJC.
Thank you. I'm so sorry if you can hear my dog barking.
We love dogs too.
Hold on just a second. I'm so sorry about that. My dog thinks she's very fierce, but she's only like 12 pounds. So, okay. So we were in the middle of the vote. So next up is Shannon. And I believe she is not here, but just in case she is, Shannon. No, all right. Kathy?
No, I'm not in favor. And I would hope, again, like the sheriffs were mentioning, that this would be based on merit, on those outcome matrix in the future, because I really think that's a big piece of what's missing in this application.
Thank you. Sunny?
I am going to vote yes, but I would echo Tyler and Aaron's comments as well.
Thank you. Rosie? Rosie, are you with us? Rosie, I see her on the list, but okay, just come back to her again. Chris?
In the absence of any other scenario that we can reasonably roll out, and noting that this is just a recommendation for the commission, and everybody else who's impacted by this will have the opportunity to come armed with the data that we weren't able to assess at the time and then present that before the commission. My vote remains yes with the across the board cut.
Thank you. And Tim?
Yeah, I'm in the same position. I'll vote yes, but I think it needs to be known to the Criminal Justice Commission that it was not necessarily based off a competition process, more of a straight across the board type scenario.
Okay, thank you. And Rob?
I'm also a yes, but want to be associated with the comments made by Tyler, Chris, and Tim.
Okay. Noted. And we're going back to Rosie. Rosie, are you present? She doesn't seem to be here. So we still have, yeah, we're gonna try and unmute her just in case. Oh, okay, yeah, we're not able to connect with her, so I'll just call one more time for Rosie for her vote. All right. Not hearing anything, so we do still have quorum, so the vote can move forward, and based on how the voting went, that does pass. So the recommendation would be to fund all applicants at that 41.55745% of their remaining of their adjusted ask, excuse me, with a small amount left over. All right. So next up, we have the vote for the CBO applications. And it sounded like the conversation was leaning to a similar decision, which would be to do an across the board percentage cut for those as well. Do folks have different thoughts about that after hearing the public comment? any additional considerations?
I just need to state a conflict of interest
Okay, thank you.
With CWRP.
Thank you. So I can try and do some real quick math and figure out what that across the board percentage would be. I believe 37% was mentioned. And this is, again, remember, it's the adjusted ask, so taking out the unallowables, adjusting the months down to 20. So it's a little different than the total request. But we can figure out what that across the board percentage would be and do a similar vote unless other, GRC members want to discuss any of the other scenarios that we have available, such as doing a different percentage, not funding all of them, and any of the other ones that we talked about. This, as was mentioned before, the scenario that was brought up was to do across the board cut. And based on my quick math, it would be at about a 35% budget reduction across the board for everyone. But as folks were noting, this is a competitive process, so we could apply scaled funding. That does sort of provide more funding to folks who ranked higher in this process. So that's also an option. Any comments, questions, concerns about funding scenarios for the CBOs? Tyler?
Yeah, I'll go. I'm supportive of the across the board cut that would be even. I wanted to address something that Kathy said earlier, which is something that I think that the review committee has to be aware of, and that's that the belief that there'll be a reduction of services in Southern Oregon to victims of labor trafficking. And while that is a distinct possibility, I believe that also I'd like everyone to think that there are labor trafficking people in Chinese marijuana grows on the entire north half of the state that we've yet to discover. And I think the across the board reduction still preserves Safety Compass's ability to work their existing Mandarin victim services program, or pardon me, culturally competent Chinese, because I know it's not always Mandarin that they're speaking. And I just would like to see that continue. So we get a better picture of what's happening in illicit grows for labor trafficking in Chinese populations. I'm just concerned that it takes the competitive nature out of it again, and we're not looking at outputs, and that's frustrating.
Thank you for your comment. Any other comments or questions or concerns at this time? I'm not seeing any hands up. So why don't we go ahead and do a similar vote again, and then we can figure out what our next steps are going to be based on that vote. So, the first step would be to just vote that we're going to fund all 3 of the CBO applicants. Are folks on board with taking a vote on that? Oh, and Shannon might be back. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do a roll call vote, and this is just to vote. The motion on the table is to fund all 3 CBO applicants, and if that passes, we can figure out the percentages. So I'm going to go through the list. Please say whether or not you want to vote yes when I call your name. So Tyler?
Yes.
Okay. Aaron?
Yes.
Shannon? I think she
Yes.
just came back. Okay, yes. Kathy is abstaining. Thank you. Sunny?
Yes.
Okay. Rosie? Still missing. Okay. Chris?
Yes.
Okay. Tim?
Yes.
Thank you. And Rob?
Yes.
All right, so that passes. So the vote is to, or the recommendation is going to be to fund all of them. So we could do, as I said, a scaled funding scenario, or we could do an across the board funding scenario. So are there any additional thoughts on which of those scenarios makes more sense? The scaled funding does take into consideration more of that competitiveness that folks are concerned about.
This is Shannon. I know I missed a significant portion of the conversation in the last 20 minutes. Is the scaled version then, is this the one we're looking at where it eliminates the fun? Oh, there we go. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry about that. I looked at that and I was a little confused. Okay, thank you. That was my only question.
You're welcome. And we wouldn't necessarily have to stick to those percentages. Those are just the budget reduction scenarios we asked applicants to include in their application. But they could be adjusted. So any comments, questions, or concerns? I'm going to pause here for just a minute to allow people time to talk. All right, no one is putting their hand up or anything. So I think maybe we'll go ahead and take a vote on doing the across the board percentages. So the percentage based on the adjusted ask. So remember, that's the one where we take out unallowables and did those reductions on the front end. So the percentage that I'm getting that would get us closest to 0 would be a 35% reduction with about $11,738 left over. So I guess the vote would be to apply that 35% reduction across the board. So I'm going to go ahead and call out names, and we're going to switch back to the original order just to mix it up. So Rob, what's your vote?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Tim
Yes.
and Chris
Yes.
and Rosie. Still MIA. Sunny,
Yes.
thank you. And Kathy,
Abstain.
Dane, thank you. Shannon
Yes.
and Aaron
Yes.
and Tyler.
Yes.
All right, so that passes out as well. So our recommendations that we're going to share with the commission are similar for both law enforcement and CBOs. It's to fund all of them with those percentage cuts that we or reductions that we talked about. So that's the 41. Oops, sorry, went back too far. 41 point odd for the law enforcement and 35% for CBOs. So we'll take that to the commission, as I said, for their October commission meeting. And they'll make a decision at that point whether to accept those recommendations, come up with their own plan, or request that we redo the recommendations. Oops, sorry. So that meeting is on the 21st at 1 p.m. If they, move forward with your recommendations from today, then we'll send out the award announcements to anyone that's awarded and start the contracting process. And then, as we discussed, if anyone chooses not to accept the funds, we'll have to, see what the total is at that point and then circle back and figure out what to do with those remaining funds. If that is what happens. I do want to note, just for members of the public or applicants that are on the call today or the meeting today, as was mentioned, we do also have public comments available during commission meetings, and that can either be written or verbal. We can send out instructions on how to do that. Since there is a deadline for the written comments, and the commission does read through those, listen to those, and take them very seriously into consideration when making their decisions. So that is available to you at this point if you would like to make public comment directly to the commissioners. And just some other announcements. We are working on and getting very close to being complete with a marijuana grant dashboard, which shows all the data that we have available. Well, not all of it, but a good portion of the data we have available from our grantees. And we're very excited about it. We're hoping to get that rolled out the end of this year. And then maybe, we'll have a more public facing opportunity to share, some of that great work that our grantees are doing with the public. And also it's annual report season, so we'll probably be contacting a lot of you to help contribute to that. So I just wanted to let everyone know to expect a call from us. Any other questions or comments at this time? And again, if you're a member of the public comment period for this meeting is over, so please contact me separately if you have any questions or comments based on the meeting, if you're a member of the public. All right. So I'm not hearing anything. So thank you guys so much. I just have to say, I know this is a really difficult conversation. These are very difficult decisions that we have to try and make with limited information. And I really appreciate you all showing up and putting in the thought and the work and the effort, and just having everyone on this grant review committee show up and be ready to participate we're very thankful for it at CJC. We really rely on your, subject matter expertise, and we're just very grateful to have you guys as part of this process. So thank you very much. And if there's nothing else, then I guess we can go ahead and close this meeting a little bit early. Okay. All right, thank you. Oh, Rob?
It was just a final closing comment. I just wanted to thank you and the CJC staff for all your hard work on this one. It's a very difficult circumstance. For my part, I will just say for the record that I will do everything I can to increase the revenues flowing into this program during the 2026 session to try to make up some of the very significant shortfall here. But we all know the circumstances that we'll be operating in, so it'll be difficult. But I and some others are going to make a go of it.
Thank you, Rob. All right, any other closing comments?
Thank you,
Just
Rima.
thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.